If we draw a line through this work, we can see that it conveys two distinct emotions. On the left side, there is sorrow, and on the right side, hope. Let's begin with sorrow. This raft carries people who are battling death, or perhaps have already succumbed to it. The massive wave approaching from the left might even sweep the lifeless body off the raft. However, the same cannot be said for the body right next to it. Someone is holding on to this body. It is likely a father who has witnessed the death of his son. He seems to have already moved past the mourning process. Yet, he still clutches his son's body with his hand, refusing to let the waves carry it away from the raft. Unlike the intense emotions displayed by others, this man exudes a sense of indifference. Whether they are rescued or not, no longer seems to matter to him. Having lost his son, he has already endured his punishment. His attitude suggests, "Let whatever happens, happen." But now, look at the figure right next to him. They are in sheer terror. As we move to the upper parts of the scene, excitement begins to emerge. These people are trying to point something out to one another. There's a clear direction everyone is looking toward. It's not hard to guess what they see. Far off in the distance, they've spotted a tiny ship. Among them, two figures are waving their scarves to catch the ship's attention. But of course, the figure higher up commands more attention than these two. This figure is like the protagonist of a play, illuminated by the spotlight on stage. If the ship notices this raft, it will be thanks to the figure at the top. If these people are to be saved, it will be because of this individual. Despite the grim depictions, the artwork doesn't fail to capture a sense of heroism. Look at the people holding on to those two, ensuring they don't fall. That act of solidarity reflects a final chance they give to hope amidst all this despair. There's an emotional flow moving diagonally from the bottom left to the top right. A dramatic shift from sorrow to hope. However, the overall atmosphere remains deeply pessimistic. The ship is so far away that it's uncertain whether it will even notice the raft. The artwork doesn't inspire confidence that these people will be rescued. It's a chilling painting. What's even more horrifying is that this painting was inspired by a real event. Because in reality, what happened was far more dreadful than what is depicted here. There is nothing a person wouldn't do to stay alive. At times, they might accuse someone of a crime. At other times, they might kill someone. And sometimes, they might even resort to cannibalism. When the ship Medusa set sail, some passengers were unaware that, in their fight for survival, they would kill someone for the first time in their lives, or even consume human flesh. Medusa, a ship that had participated in Napoleon's naval wars, set sail from France on June 17th, accompanied by 3 other ships heading toward West Africa. Its mission was to take Senegal from the British and turn it into a colony. The ship carried high-ranking individuals, and since a governor on board was eager to reach the destination quickly, the captain started to rush as well. To save time, the captain decided to take a shortcut. By changing its route, Medusa lost contact with the 3 ships accompanying it. Even worse, the captain hadn't been to sea in a long time. He realized far too late that he had steered the ship into shallow waters. Everyone suddenly realized that Medusa had run aground, and despite all efforts, it couldn't be freed. There was nothing else to do. Medusa was beyond repair and unusable. The lifeboats had to be deployed. However, Medusa, which carried 400 people, only had enough lifeboats for 250. In response, the passengers hastily used parts of the ship to construct a makeshift raft, 7 meters wide and 20 meters long. 147 people who could not board the lifeboats were placed in these lifeboats. Needless to say, the 147 people placed on this raft were lower-ranking individuals. The spots on the lifeboats had already been secured for the high-ranking passengers. The initial plan was as follows. The raft had no means of moving on its own, so it was tied to the lifeboats with ropes. The lifeboats would act as tow vessels and pull the raft to the shore. But the lifeboats struggled to move the raft. Additionally, those on the lifeboats feared that the people on the raft might attack them. In such a tense atmosphere, it wasn't hard to imagine someone on the raft killing a person on the lifeboat to take their place. Ultimately, the people on the lifeboats abandoned the raft. They cut the ropes, effectively leaving the 147 people on the raft to die. This marked the beginning of a survival struggle that would last for days. There were almost no provisions. The biscuits salvaged from the ship were consumed on the first day. Following a conflict, they lost their remaining water supply. All that remained were a few barrels of wine. Those who tried to quench their thirst with wine only worsened their condition. By the fourth day, only 67 of the 147 people were still alive. Each passing day, the number of people on the raft dwindled. Don't think they only died of hunger or thirst. People on the raft were killing each other. A fight for space was constantly taking place. Amid the waves and winds, the most secure part of the raft was its center. Those on the edges could easily fall into the sea with a small misstep. Falling into the sea meant certain death. Some fights for the center of the raft ended with people being thrown overboard and killed. Everyone had lost their sanity. The weak were thrown into the sea. Some of the dead bodies were even treated as provisions. To survive, cannibalism emerged. Some people couldn't bear all that was happening and threw themselves into the sea, committing suicide. By the 13th day, only 15 people remained on the raft. At that moment, something happened that could almost be called a miracle. Remember how we mentioned at the beginning that Medusa was accompanied by 3 ships during its voyage? After Medusa changed its route, it lost contact with these ships. One of those ships happened to pass close to the raft's location. I say happened to because this ship had no prior knowledge of the raft or the people on it. As soon as the raft's occupants saw the ship, they did everything they could to draw its attention. At first, they couldn't get the ship to notice them, and it disappeared from view. About 2 hours later, the ship reappeared. This time, the people on the raft managed to make themselves seen. The ship finally rescued the desperate survivors on the makeshift raft. However, it would not be accurate to say they were all saved. Some of the rescued individuals died shortly after from the illnesses they had contracted. This true story, more horrifying than a horror film, was recorded in history as one of the greatest tragedies the seas have ever witnessed. Now we must turn our attention to the painter. Théodore Géricault was 25 years old when this tragedy occurred. He was already drawn to concepts like death and decay. Moreover, he was seeking a sensational subject that could become a turning point in his artistic career. When Géricault heard about the Medusa incident, he knew he had found what he was looking for. He decided to depict the people stranded on the raft. However, he didn't begin painting right away. He needed to conduct in-depth research. The painter first contacted journalists who had reported on the accident, learning the details of the event. Since his work would depict corpses, he visited hospital morgues and sketched cadavers. To observe decomposition firsthand, he even brought some severed limbs back to his studio. Most importantly, Géricault managed to locate 2 survivors of the tragedy and interviewed them. However, Géricault faced a dilemma. Which moment of the event should he depict? So much had happened on the raft: cannibalism, murder, suicide, and eventually the rescue. Géricault began sketching scenarios. He considered depicting the moment the raft was abandoned by those on the lifeboats. Then he thought about illustrating the mutiny and executions that had occurred on the raft. At one point, he even contemplated focusing on the acts of cannibalism. However, none of these ideas satisfied him. Depicting cannibalism in particular might have been too shocking for audiences when the work was displayed. Géricault, being romantic by nature, sought an emotional moment to depict. For example, he thought about painting the moment the people on the raft were rescued. Not a bad idea, perhaps? But Géricault ultimately chose to capture not the moment of their rescue, but the moment they thought they were being rescued. As we recall from the first section, the ship that would eventually rescue the raft's occupants didn't notice it on its first appearance. It had appeared briefly, only to disappear again, returning much later. During its initial sighting, the people on the raft were overcome with wild excitement, only to be plunged into despair and hopelessness when the ship vanished. According to the testimony of a survivor, they fell from a state of frantic joy to profound grief. In an instant, Géricault chose to depict the moment just before the ship disappeared for the first time. That's why the ship appears so small in the painting. Within seconds, it would no longer be visible. The intense excitement would soon turn into crushing disappointment. Even though the ship eventually returned to rescue them, the period during which it had vanished created a haunting sense of despair among the survivors. You might ask, doesn't the raft look a bit small? After all, the raft carried 140 people, measured 20 meters in length, and was 7 meters wide. Géricault, of course, knew this, but depicting the entire raft would have taken up significant space on the canvas. To enhance the dramatic effect, he chose to depict only part of the raft. Additionally, Géricault altered the weather conditions. It is known that the day the raft was rescued, the weather was sunny. However, Géricault opted for a stormy depiction. With these foundational elements in place, all that remained for Géricault was to transform his sketches into a finished masterpiece. He cut his hair, locked himself in his studio, and worked with intense concentration behind closed doors. He first created a few studies. For example, take a look at this earlier work of his. On its own, it captures a gloomy atmosphere quite well, but compared to the final masterpiece, it falls short. For one thing, the ship is too close. This makes the ship's disappearance seem less realistic in this version. In the final work, the most striking detail is how small the ship appears. Moreover, while the father's grief is more pronounced in this earlier version, his contemplative and resigned expression in the final painting feels far more impactful. Most importantly, this earlier version lacks the sense of heroism and dramatic intensity present in the final work. We see two figures trying to draw the ship's attention, but in the final painting, the elevated figures standing on barrels, supported by others, create a far more powerful sense of rising hope. To be fair, this earlier work was one of Géricault's study pieces. He identified its shortcomings and made adjustments. We shouldn't overlook how this study contributed to the final masterpiece. Notice how high resolution the painting I've used is. No matter how much I zoom in, the quality barely diminishes. This is because the visual file of the painting is quite large, as the painting itself is enormous. The canvas measures nearly 5 meters in height and 7 meters in width. The figures in the painting are almost life-sized. Imagine yourself viewing this painting in person at the Louvre Museum. Its realistic dimensions would pull you into the scene. Now, let's turn to the painting's exhibition. The process of displaying this work was as turbulent as its creation. When the raft of the Medusa was exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1819, it both fascinated and horrified viewers. Some found the work too brutal. They believed art should not be so savage. Most importantly, the painting was perceived as a political critique. After all, the Medusa disaster was a source of shame for the government. The ship's captain had been appointed due to his connections with the government rather than merit. This lack of competency and favoritism resulted in an inexperienced captain grounding the ship and causing a catastrophe. Furthermore, the fact that high-ranking passengers secured spots on the lifeboats while abandoning the lower classes to die tarnished France's reputation both domestically and internationally. This painting stood out starkly among the other works at the exhibition. The majority of the Salon's displays celebrated patriotic, grandiose moments. But Géricault's work did not depict a moment of pride at all. Still, the painting was exhibited, although its title was altered. The word Medusa was removed from the description, and the painting was renamed A Scene of a Shipwreck. Another controversial aspect was the inclusion of a black figure in the painting. The purpose of the Medusa voyage was to colonize Senegal. At the time, the government viewed the slave trade favorably. Géricault, however, opposed slavery, and his heroic depiction of the black figure in the painting was not just a critique of the government's policies. In the imagery used by anti-slavery movements of that era, black figures were typically depicted in chains, kneeling, and pleading. By contrast, Géricault's depiction shows a heroic figure, a symbol of hope. This innovative portrayal would go on to inspire anti-slavery movements. While the painting's tone is somber, in the context of slavery, it can be interpreted as a symbol of freedom achieved after immense suffering. From the perspective of the French government, it could also be seen as a call for revolution in the face of corruption. Let's set aside the political debates surrounding the painting and focus on its significance within art movements. Viewers at the salon had a shared thought. The painting left them torn. The interplay of hope and despair was so intertwined that it was difficult to decide which emotion to embrace. Should we feel relief that some of these people might survive, or should we confront the horrific reality depicted below? Additionally, doesn't something about the depiction of the bodies in this artwork strike you as odd? Look at their muscular, aesthetic forms. Considering what these individuals endured on the raft, their resemblance to ancient Greek sculptures feels absurd. Why are the bodies of people who had been starving and dehydrated for days portrayed with such grandeur? This aspect of the artwork faintly reminds us of the neoclassicism movement. In this style, we often encounter heroic figures who sacrifice themselves for a higher cause. Let's compare the death of Socrates, a defining example of neoclassicism, with the Raft of the Medusa. Observe the muscular physique of Socrates. In reality, he was far from such a striking figure, just as the people on the raft were nothing like their portrayals in this artwork. As in Géricault's piece, death is present in the death of Socrates. However, Socrates' death is a philosophical act of sacrifice. He does not fear death, he embraces it. In contrast, death in the Raft of the Medusa has no connection to a noble cause. It is merely the outcome of humanity's primal struggle for survival. The people depicted are victims of an incompetent captain and a cruel system that deemed them unworthy of a place on the lifeboats because of their lower social status. Even those mourning Socrates' death are depicted with a certain elegance, as if part of a theatrical scene. Now, take a look at the grief in Géricault's work. It is raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. The Raft of the Medusa may contain traces of neoclassicism, but its essence departs significantly from this movement. The work aligns more with Romanticism. Of course, like any artist, Géricault was influenced by others, one of whom was Michelangelo. In Michelangelo's The Last Judgment, he portrays people condemned to hell, with some being crowded onto a boat. What unfolds on that boat is not so different from what happens in the Raft of the Medusa. The imagery evokes cannibalism, executions, and the desperation of sinners who cling to the boat, refusing to let go. After all, stepping off the boat meant being cast into hell. Similarly, being thrown from the Raft of the Medusa into the sea was its own kind of hell. While Michelangelo depicted a spiritual hell, Géricault's hell is a worldly one. Géricault was also inspired by Pierre-Paul Proudhon's Justice and Divine Vengeance Pursuing Crime. In that painting, we see a corpse on the ground. To its left stands the murderer, who is about to face judgment from the figures representing divine vengeance and justice. The focal point, however, is the corpse on the ground. If you look closely, you'll notice a striking resemblance between the bodies in Géricault's painting and the one in Proudhon's work. When we consider the historical context behind the Raft of the Medusa, certain details begin to make more sense. For instance, that bloody axe has likely come into contact with the flesh of the people on the raft, particularly when considering the acts of cannibalism that took place. Look at the corpse on the left. It seems as though the lower half of its body is missing. It might simply be hidden beneath the raft, but given the context of cannibalism, one can't help but wonder, was this man's lower body consumed? Throughout this video, we've delved into the grim depths of this horrific event. Now, I pose this question to you. Which figure in this painting strikes you as the most haunting? For me, it's not the grieving father or the heroic black figure at the top. It's the man in the center, in the midst of a breakdown. Consider all the barbaric acts that occurred on that raft. This man seems to be reliving every one of them in his mind. Calling this a mere struggle for survival feels inadequate. Even if these individuals survived physically, they could never escape the psychological scars left by this ordeal. Nothing would ever be the same for them. Perhaps we should view this artwork through the lens of the hell Michelangelo depicted. This raft was a living hell, and for the survivors, that hell will persist in their minds every time they remember what they endured.